Imagine standing on a sheet of floating ice in Antarctica, watching your ship die. Not in a storm, not in battle, not in one sudden moment of chaos, but slowly, quietly, inevitably. The hull groans under impossible pressure. Timber bends. Beams crack. Planks split with sounds like gunshots. The ship that carried you to the bottom of the world twists in the grip of the pack ice, as if something huge and invisible is crushing it from all sides. You can do nothing but watch. No rescue is coming. No radio can save you. There is no harbor, no road, no passing ship over the horizon. Only ice, darkness, wind, and the certainty that if the ship goes down, you may vanish with it. That was the reality facing Ernest Shackleton and the crew of the Endurance in 1915, trapped in the Weddell Sea during what became one of the greatest survival stories ever recorded. A ship trapped and destroyed in Antarctic ice. A crew stranded for months on drifting floes. Starvation, frostbite, open boats on one of the worst oceans on Earth, and a final desperate voyage in a tiny lifeboat across hundreds of miles of freezing sea. And yet the most astonishing part is this. After the Endurance was lost, every single man survived. That outcome feels impossible because this expedition was never supposed to become a survival story at all. It began as a mission of glory.
In 1914, Shackleton set out to do what no one had yet done, cross the Antarctic continent from sea to sea. The South Pole had already been reached, so he turned his ambition toward what he believed was the last great prize of polar exploration, the first crossing of Antarctica itself. To reach the continent, he needed the right ship. That ship was the Endurance. She was built for ice, with thick wooden sides made from immensely strong timber, designed to withstand crushing pressure that would splinter an ordinary vessel. She was built to survive punishment, and her very name seemed like a promise. On board were 28 men, along with sled dogs, supplies, scientific equipment, and the full weight of Shackleton's ambition. At first, the expedition moved more or less as planned, but Antarctica does not destroy people dramatically at first. It often begins by closing doors quietly. By January 1915, the Endurance was making its way through the Weddell Sea toward the Antarctic coast when the ice thickened around them. At first, it was only an inconvenience. Drifting floes, narrowing lanes of water, slower progress. The men had seen pack ice before. This was expected. Then the gaps ahead tightened further. The ship pushed forward, slowed, and stopped. The sea around them seemed to harden. Before the crew fully grasped how serious it was, the Endurance had become trapped in the ice. Ships had been frozen in before and later drifted free. Shackleton and his men hoped the pack would loosen with time. It never did. Instead, the Endurance became a prisoner, carried helplessly by the drifting ice farther and farther from its goal. The dream of crossing Antarctica began to die without a single man setting foot on the continent's interior. Still, for a while, hope remained. The crew kept busy. They worked, they exercised the dogs, they hunted seals, they read, played games, sang songs, and tried to live like sailors waiting out a delay instead of men drifting toward catastrophe. Shackleton encouraged that routine because he understood something crucial. In prolonged isolation, idleness could become as dangerous as cold. Antarctica attacks the mind as much as the body. Long darkness, confinement, helplessness, and the endless sameness of the landscape can slowly unravel even strong men. Shackleton was determined not to let that happen. So he organized life carefully. Everyone had tasks. Everyone had purpose. He kept a close eye on personalities, tensions, and emotional strain. That instinct, more than any dramatic speech, would become the foundation of the crew's survival. Then winter came. The Antarctic winter shrank the world down to cold, darkness, and pressure. The sun vanished for long stretches. Temperatures fell brutally. At night, as men lay in their bunks, they could hear the Endurance protesting, a chorus of creaks, groans, and cracking timber that made the vessel sound less like a machine than a living thing in pain. Through the winter of 1915, the pressure built. The floes around the ship moved, pressed, and collided with extraordinary force. By October, the ice no longer simply held the ship, it squeezed it. Massive slabs pressed against the hull from both sides. The vessel lifted, twisted, and shuddered. Timbers buckled. Water forced its way in. Men watched as the ship built to survive polar seas began to fail piece by piece. Shackleton did not cling to denial. Before the final collapse, he accepted that the ship might not be saved. He ordered stores moved onto the ice: tents, food, fuel, sledges, rope, tools, and the 3 lifeboats that would later mean the difference between life and death. It was grim work. The men were salvaging what they could from the wreck of their own expedition, while the ship that had brought them there slowly died behind them. Then the end came. The pressure became too much. The hull gave way. The stern lifted. Water rushed in. The Endurance, trapped and broken, slipped beneath the ice-choked sea. One moment it was their shelter, their world, their connection to civilization. The next, it was gone. Now the men were alone. No ship, no radio, no route home. No realistic chance that anyone in the world knew exactly where they were. This is where many expeditions would have turned into tragedy. But Shackleton did something extraordinarily important in that moment. He changed the mission instantly. Crossing Antarctica no longer mattered. Discovery no longer mattered. There was only one goal left: bring every man home alive. That shift may have been the most important decision of the entire ordeal. Once the old dream died, the men were no longer trying to rescue a failed expedition. They were trying to survive. They made camp on the ice among crates, canvas, cooking gear, and salvaged supplies. They called it Camp Dump. It looked like human civilization had been smashed apart and scattered across the floe. But survival required hard choices. Weight mattered. Food mattered. Energy mattered. Shackleton ordered each man to keep only the absolute minimum in personal belongings: watches, keepsakes, extra clothing, letters from home. Most of it had to go. To make the point absolute, Shackleton threw away his own gold watch and gold coins. It was a deliberate act of leadership. He was showing the men that in this place, comfort and pride meant nothing. Survival was the only currency left. And yet he also understood that practicality alone was not enough. Men do not survive extreme conditions by calories alone. They also survive on rhythm, humor, and fragments of identity. So diaries were kept. Rituals continued. And most famously, Shackleton allowed Leonard Hussey to keep his banjo, calling it vital mental medicine. That decision sounds absurd until you understand the deeper truth. Morale was not separate from survival. There were harsher sacrifices to come. The dogs, once essential to the overland crossing that would never happen, now consumed precious food. Some had to be shot. So did Mrs. Chippy, the expedition cat. Men cried openly. In a world stripped of comfort, these animals had become symbols of warmth and companionship. Then Shackleton ordered a march. The plan was to drag the lifeboats and supplies northward across the pack ice toward open water. On paper it sounded possible. In reality, it was almost unbearable. The Antarctic pack was not a smooth plain. It was a shattered landscape of pressure ridges, broken slabs, soft snow, and unstable surfaces. Hauling heavy wooden boats over it was nearly impossible. The men harnessed themselves like beasts and pulled. They strained over ridges, stumbled into cracks, sweated under effort, then froze the moment they stopped moving. Days of backbreaking labor gained almost nothing. So once again, Shackleton changed the plan. They stopped marching and waited. For months they drifted on the ice, carried north by the moving pack. They hunted seals and penguins to supplement their rations. They rationed fuel. They endured monotony, cold, hunger, and uncertainty. But somehow, under Shackleton's discipline, the group held together. Then, in April 1916, after more than a year trapped in the Antarctic, the pack finally began to open. At last, there was water. The 3 lifeboats were launched into an ocean crowded with drifting ice and lashed by bitter wind. They were small, overloaded, and never intended for such a voyage. The men crammed inside them, soaked by freezing spray day and night. Salt water stiffened their clothes into icy shells. Sleep came in fragments, if at all. They bailed constantly. Sometimes they sheltered briefly on floes, only to wake to cracks beneath them or freezing water rising where they lay. This was not rescue. It was simply the next stage of not dying. After 12 terrible days in the boats, they reached Elephant Island, a desolate strip of rock at the edge of the Southern Ocean. It was the first solid ground they had stood on in nearly a year and a half. That alone felt miraculous. But Elephant Island was no true refuge. It was remote, barren, and far from normal shipping routes. No one would stumble across them there. If the men remained, they would likely die in place. Shackleton understood this immediately. Rescue would not come unless someone went out and found it. So he made the decision that transformed an already astonishing survival story into legend. He would take the strongest of the lifeboats, the James Caird, and attempt to sail roughly 800 miles across one of the most violent oceans on Earth to South Georgia, where there were whaling stations.
It was an outrageous plan. The James Caird was only 22 feet long, but it was the only chance they had. The boat was strengthened as best they could. Supplies were packed with brutal care. Shackleton selected 5 men to accompany him: Frank Worsley, the brilliant navigator whose skill would be indispensable; Tom Crean, one of the toughest men in polar exploration; and 3 others chosen for strength, endurance, and morale. Then, on April 24, 1916, they left. For the 22 men remaining on Elephant Island, watching that small boat disappear into the white emptiness must have felt like witnessing a final farewell. If the James Caird failed, everyone on the island was doomed. What followed was one of the greatest small boat journeys in history. For more than 2 weeks, the James Caird battled the Southern Ocean. Monstrous waves, freezing spray, brutal wind, and relentless instability. The men were constantly wet. Ice built up on the boat and had to be hacked away before the weight capsized them. Their drinking water became tainted with salt. Sleep was almost non-existent. Every hour brought the possibility of being rolled, swamped, or blown off course into oblivion. And navigation was everything. South Georgia was a tiny target in an enormous, unforgiving ocean. Missing it could mean death. Worsley managed the nearly impossible task of finding their way by taking quick sextant readings whenever clouds broke for a moment and calculating their position despite the violent motion of the sea. Against reason, they reached South Georgia. But even there, the ordeal was not finished. Storms drove them to the wrong side of the island, far from the whaling stations they needed. The coastline was too dangerous to sail around. Between them and help stood the island's interior. Mountains, glaciers, and terrain that had never been crossed.
Leaving 3 of the boat crew behind, Shackleton set out with Worsley and Crean to cross South Georgia on foot. They carried minimal gear: rope, a little food, and a carpenter's adze. No proper map existed for the route ahead. They climbed ice slopes, crossed ridges, slid down dangerous descents, and pushed through unknown mountain terrain in a state of extreme exhaustion. They marched for 36 hours with almost no sleep. At one point, terrified that real rest might mean death from exposure, Shackleton allowed only a few minutes' pause, then woke the others and told them they had slept far longer than they really had. He was rationing hope. Then, on the morning of May 21, 1916, they heard one of the most beautiful sounds imaginable: the whistle of the whaling station at Grytviken. After months of ice, wind, hunger, and silence, that sound must have seemed unreal, proof that the human world still existed. When Shackleton and his 2 companions stumbled into the station, they were filthy, frostbitten, exhausted, and scarcely recognizable. The station manager, Thorolf Sorel, reportedly stared in disbelief before recognizing Shackleton. But Shackleton's work was not done. He still had to bring everyone else back. First, the 3 men left on the far side of South Georgia were rescued. Getting back to Elephant Island was far worse. Again and again, rescue attempts were turned back by sea ice, storms, and impossible conditions. Weeks stretched into months. On Elephant Island, the 22 men Shackleton had left behind waited through a long, miserable winter under shelters made from overturned boats. They suffered from frostbite, illness, dampness, exhaustion, and uncertainty. Yet discipline held there too. Frank Wild, left in command, kept the men going with a simple, repeated instruction: "Pack up your things, boys. The boss may come today." And then, finally, Shackleton returned. On August 30, 1916, a rescue vessel broke through to Elephant Island. As it approached, Shackleton counted the figures on shore with private dread. 22 men had been left there. 22 men were still alive. Not one had been lost after the sinking of the Endurance. That fact is so astonishing because, yes, there was luck. Without luck, they would have died. They found food when they desperately needed it. The ice opened before starvation destroyed them. The James Caird found South Georgia instead of missing it. Storms did not finish them when they easily could have. Worsley's navigation bordered on miraculous. But luck alone does not explain this ending. What brought them home was leadership, discipline, adaptability, and emotional control. Shackleton understood that survival in the extreme is not simply a physical contest. Men also die from hopelessness, confusion, panic, bad timing, and broken morale. Shackleton avoided those traps with extraordinary clarity. When the men finally returned home, the world they had left behind was almost unrecognizable. The First World War had swallowed Europe. Against the slaughter in the trenches, their private war against ice and distance seemed strangely small. Some of the men went directly into military service. Some would not survive the war.
Shackleton himself never fully escaped the pull of the polar world. In 1921, he returned south again, and in January 1922 at Grytviken, the same place where he had once staggered into salvation, he died of a heart attack and was buried there. It is a fitting ending in its own way. Shackleton rests in the landscape that nearly destroyed him and made him legendary. This is not the story of man conquering nature. It is the story of nature crushing the original dream completely, and of human beings surviving anyway. Everything was taken from them: the ship, the plan, the certainty, the comfort, the illusion of control. What remained were the essentials: hunger, fear, duty, endurance, loyalty, and the refusal to abandon one another. At the bottom of the world, surrounded by ice and silence, Shackleton proved something few leaders ever truly prove. When the plan is dead, when the map is useless, and when hope itself is freezing over, leadership is not about glory, it is about getting your people home.